The Honorable John Paul Phelan is the Tectadala for the Carlow Kilkenny constituency until recently. And he has also served as Minister of State for Local Government and Electoral Reform from 2017 to 2020, served as a senator from the Labour panel, and he is the Fine Gael representative, or the Fine Gael politician for his area. He graduated from Waterford Institute of Technology with an economics and finance degree. He was elected to the Kilkenny County Council in 1999 for the Piltown local electoral area, the youngest person ever elected to the council. He has sat on the joint
Oireachtas.
Thank you. Oireachtas Committee on Justice, Law and Defense. He is one of the Irish delegates sitting on the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and is an Irish representative on the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly. And you can update us on any of those things that might have changed since the change in government. But it is my distinct pleasure to welcome him today, and let's hear about Ireland.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Angela. I have a lot of connections with the States. 10 of my late father's aunts and uncles emigrated to America, including 3 of them who are called Phelan. We pronounce it Phelan in Ireland, but all my cousins in America are Phelan, including my father's, my father's first cousin, Ed Phelan, was the mayor of Peoria Heights for a long, long time. I think Mike is still there, who's my second cousin. But Mike Gillis was in contact with me, his great-grandfather and my grandfather were brothers. So that's the connection. And I've visited Peoria, although I must confess it's a few years ago now, but I will be back, to use a famous phrase. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to say a few words about Brexit, which has been, if you leave aside COVID, the biggest kind of political issue in this part of the world for the last 4 years. It was in June of 2016 that the then British government of the Conservative Party, led by David Cameron, had a referendum, and that referendum, the population of Britain, the United Kingdom, by 52% to 48%, so by a narrow margin, but a margin nonetheless, voted to leave the European Union. Britain and Ireland and Denmark joined the European Union together in 1974. The original 6 countries that made up the European Economic Community, as it originally was, were France and Germany and Italy, and what we call the 3 Benelux countries, that's Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. And then Britain and Ireland and Denmark joined in 74. Subsequently, now they're up to 28 members, with pretty much every country on the continent of the main continent of Europe, with the exception of Switzerland, is a member of the European Union. Britain, it's fair to say that membership of the European community was a controversial issue really throughout my youth growing up. It was always a subject in the United Kingdom that provoked great debate on either side of the question. Particularly, I'm thinking back to the late 80s, early 90s, when Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister, and she famously instigated a renegotiation of the European Union's budget because she felt the British taxpayers were contributing too much annually. And that was the first kind of deviation from the regular contribution and the even standard that had been adopted for every member of the European Union up till then. Britain got a dispensation, and it sought more and got more dispensations in the intervening 30 years until the Brexit vote took place. It's also, I think really, to start from the start, we have to put the European Union in the context of the fact that it is the most successful peace process that there has been in the history of the world, pretty much. Not just the 2 world wars, but the continent of Europe was blighted with a very significant warfare going back through the centuries, whether it's Napoleonic Wars or 30 Years' Wars and different conflagrations that took place over hundreds and hundreds of years. So post the end of the Second World War, A lot of US money was pumped into the continent of Europe through the Marshall Plan, which we still learn about in our history classes in Ireland. Ireland, which was non-participant in the World War II, was still the recipient of funding, particularly for our agricultural sector, because it was recognised that with the rest of the continent in tatters, pretty much, that Irish food would be needed to feed people, and that's where our end of the Marshall Plan money was invested. And even to this day, in certain sectors in the Irish economy, we export over 90% of what we produce in terms of food. I'll come back to that later, because in terms of the future relationship of the United Kingdom to the European Union, and particularly to Ireland, that is still a kind of a key issue. But as I said, 1974 was when Britain and Ireland and Denmark joined. What was essentially at the start, it was referred to originally following the Treaty of Rome, which was in the 1950s, which established the first European community. It was referred to as the Coal and Steel Union, which was between those 6 original members, and it was designed to be a common market in coal and steel and in energy in particular. And that broadened, and it broadened with several different treaties which were adopted by the parliaments of the different member states. The last one actually was just post the economic crash in 2010. There was what was called a Fiscal Stability Treaty, which places limits on the budget deficits that each member state within the Union can run up each year in their budget. That was the last most recent treaty. And they're all actually, I have a niece who's in third level in college studying European Union law at the moment. It's a whole aspect of how our courts and legal system operates. And actually it goes to the heart of part of the argument that some of the Brexiteers in Britain have had for the last 30 years. At the moment, the European Court of Justice, which is the judicial arm of the European Union, has sovereignty, if you like, over all of the member states of the Union. And this became a particularly big issue, understandably in many respects, for politicians in particular, but also citizens in the wider sense in the United Kingdom in the last few years, that British law, United Kingdom law, is subject to the European Union treaties and the legal arrangements that are agreed between the member states. So that was an issue. You mentioned in your introduction of me, Angela, actually, that I was formerly a member of the Council of Europe, which is a different organization. Every country on the continent, including the Russians, are members of the Council of Europe. There's 50-something odd members. That was set up, again, post-World War II, with a view to ensuring that there would be standards of law, standards of treatment of individuals. So, things like the European Convention on Human Rights, which fed into the United Nations Convention on Human Rights, but the European one was the kind of forerunner in that area. But again, all members of the Council of Europe, all 50 odd members, their international domestic law in relation to human rights and other areas is subject to their membership of the Council of Europe. And it's one of the things that's been effective in ensuring that there hasn't been as much open animosity and downright warfare between members in the last, since the Second World War. It hasn't always worked. I'm thinking in particular of the breakup of Yugoslavia and what happened when those countries split in the early 1990s. Interestingly enough, both Armenia and Azerbaijan, who are once again at each other's throats in the last week or 10 days over Nagorno-Karabakh, both of those countries are members of the Council of Europe, and it is the Council of Europe at the moment that's trying to get them to the table to negotiate some sort of a settlement. But Nagorno-Karabakh, like when I was a kid, it was a topical issue, and I think it's just one of those. It's one of those geographic areas where there will always be a certain level of, maybe not outright hostility, but a certain level of tension. And another one of those areas is Ireland and the island of Ireland. the Ireland that I grew up in, I was born in 1978. I was 42 last Sunday, as it happens. Every morning, when I was having my breakfast with my mother before I'd go to school, the news was dominated by who had been blown up, who had been shot, who had been murdered the night before, whether they were on the nationalist or the unionist side, or there was all sorts of atrocities on both sides. And our common membership of the European Union, along with support from external forces like the United States, was actually key in the drawing up of the Good Friday Agreement in 1997. That was the year I finished high school, I finished secondary school, and we had a referendum on both sides of the border on the island of Ireland, and both sides voted overwhelmingly. I think in the Republic of Ireland, the vote was kind of 97% to 3% to accept the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. And basically the terms of the agreement were that the government of Ireland, of Northern Ireland, into the future, would require both communities to participate in the structures of government, and also that the constitutional position of Northern Ireland was protected, and that whatever the majority will of the population would be, that was the only thing that could change the constitutional position of Northern Ireland. As I said, common membership of the European Union played a key part in that, because one of the key aspects of membership of the European Union is the free movement of people, free movement of labour, the free movement of capital, the free movement of goods and services. There are, many of you, I'm sure, have travelled extensively on the mainland continent of Europe. And like if you're crossing between France and Germany at Strasbourg or wherever now, which was, one of the most contested spaces of ground on the planet, there's no border checkpoint now, and there hasn't been for quite many years, until peace came to the island of Ireland in the late 1990s. We still had border infrastructure on the island between the Republic and the north of Ireland. And the fear in the midst of the Brexit issue is that the extremists that were always there haven't actually fully gone away. Some people have taken up fully political pathways to expressing their views on the issue of a united Ireland, or of Northern Ireland remaining part of the United Kingdom. But if you physically reimpose infrastructure on the island of Ireland because the United Kingdom has left the European Union, then you create a target for those extremists to literally plant bombs and fire bullets, and that in itself would lead to a snowball effect of where violence returns to the streets of Ireland. As I said just earlier there, I suppose Ireland is one of the huge success stories, not just economically of the European Union, but also in terms of that peace that exists, that hadn't existed for well over 100 years in any way, shape or form, and for long more than that in terms of the overall history of the relationship between Britain and Ireland. So at the moment, the referendum that I mentioned earlier took place in June of 2016, and there was a narrow but a majority nonetheless of the British electorate voted to leave the European Union. Complicating that matter even further is the fact that in Scotland, the citizens there voted by a majority to remain in the European Union, and in Northern Ireland, the voters there in both communities, interestingly enough, voted to remain members of the European Union. But needless to say, because the UK is one political entity, the overall vote is the one that counts, and that overall vote was for leaving the European Union. As things stand at present, that full leaving of the common market and everything associated with it is to take place at the end of this year, the 31st of December. You would probably all have seen some of the political shenanigans, for want of a better term, in the House of Commons at the end of last year, when no majority was available to vote to support the exit agreement that had been negotiated between the British government and the remaining members of the European Union. That subsequently led to a British election just before Christmas last year, when Mr. Johnson received a significant majority in Parliament. And actually in the end of January this year, which seems so long ago considering everything that's happened, particularly with COVID, since the British Parliament voted to accept that withdrawal agreement. The withdrawal agreement deals with many issues, but one part of it is a political agreement, if you like, concerning the island of Ireland, and a commitment by the British government, as well as by the Irish government and the European Union, that there will be no physical border infrastructure erected on the island. You will possibly have seen in US coverage quite a number of prominent Irish American US politicians, both 12 months ago and again in more recent times, even up as far as Speaker Pelosi actually saying that the American authorities and Congress will not support any future agreement that would see the establishment of border infrastructure on the island of Ireland. Because that's happening and coming to a head now, because while the British are currently negotiating with the remaining members of the European Union with regard to a trade deal, they're also investigating and negotiating with the United States and with other countries around the world. One of the issues that was the big political issue in that Brexit referendum was the fact that the European Union does those negotiations on behalf of all the countries that are members, and that Britain itself didn't have independent authority to negotiate trade deals. That's one of the key aspects, I suppose, of membership of the common market, that you pool your resources. The European Union remains a political union that has about 450 million of a population, so it's a significant market in itself. And a lot of people in Ireland, I suppose, initially when Brexit started, thought that it would involve a direct negotiation between Ireland and the United Kingdom on questions of infrastructure on the border and other economic issues. It doesn't, because we are represented as part of that European Union negotiation team. There's a designated European Commissioner called Michel Barnier, who was for many years the Prime Minister of France, who has been, since the Brexit vote happened in 2016, he's been the lead negotiator for the European Union. And we're lucky from an Irish perspective in that he spent quite a bit of time early after his appointment in Ireland, physically visiting the border, physically looking at, the impact that reinstalling army checkpoints would have, and looking at it economically, because quite a lot of, if you can imagine yourself, I mean, it's a few years since I was in Peoria, but I know that a lot of my family over there are Cardinals supporters. So if you can imagine crossing into St. Louis and having to have, border checks, having the army, what would you call it? You have the Illinois army on one side and the Missouri army on the other. We're joking about it now, but in terms of the Irish context, that's the potential of that's what used to exist until the late 1990s, as I said, on the island of Ireland. Quite a lot of people commute daily, both ways, between the north and the Republic, and the other way, whether it's for education, whether it's for work in particular. And needless to say, border infrastructure will have an effect on that. But the big one, and the big political one, is the correct fear, I believe, that if you reinstall infrastructure on the border, you give people a target. And the extremists have gone quiet. They do still conduct the odd a car bomb attack, and there have been several incidents in the last 30 years that have led to loss of life, and significant loss of life. But they don't have any significant support from any sector of the community. The danger is that if you put that infrastructure on the border, that you give them a target, and suddenly people who are adversely affected by border checks or whatever suddenly are politically supporting people who are returning to terrorism. and from an Irish government perspective, and in fairness, from the European Union. I mean, the support that we have gotten as a tiny little country, population-wise. I mean, we have about 5 million, so we're a little over 1% of the population of the European Union, and yet we have the full support of the other member states in ensuring that that infrastructure isn't returned. Where things are at present, you may have seen it somewhat in your own local media coverage in the States. There's an internal market bill which was discussed in the House of Commons this week. I think it finished this week, maybe perhaps next week. It's going to the House of Lords. But that bill actually involves a decision by the House of Commons now and the British government to unilaterally drop the political agreement that had been part of the withdrawal treaty that they approved in January of this year. I mean, I've never seen anything like this in terms of international law or international relations, where a serious country, like a proper first world country that would be considered a bastion of democracy, now suddenly, a few months after adopting an internationally binding treaty, is passed legislation in one of its chambers of parliament in the last few days, which seeks to abandon unilaterally that agreement. Obviously, it has to go through the second house, the House of Lords, and there will be amendments there. But the British system is a bit like our one here. The House of Lords can't indefinitely strike down legislation. It is really a secondary chamber. In Ireland, if you can imagine, our system is kind of the reverse of yours. I was a senator for years, but in Ireland, a senator is a very different category in terms of a legislator. You're very much the secondary person. The members of the lower house of Congress, you would call it, the Dáil, we call it. That, good to get back to that phrase, TD. We have primacy, and not only do we have primacy, but the Senate in Ireland can't indefinitely delay legislation. It can only delay it for a period of time. And it's the same with the House of Lords in Britain. But what we have seen, there was a rebellion, if you like, by a number of Conservative Party MPs, not enough to strike down the legislation or to amend it yet. But the hope is that either it will be amended in the House of Commons, or secondly, that this legislation will not be needed if there is a negotiated agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom before the 1st of January next year as to the shape of a trade agreement between the UK and the European Union into the future. There's a lot of kind of political views in Europe that this particular bill, the internal market bill is what it's called in Britain, that is a form of saber rattling, if you like, that it's being used politically to kind of put pressure on the European Union to give good or better terms in terms of the trade deal with the United Kingdom into the future. It certainly would be our ambition and our hope in Ireland that is what it is, that the internal market bill will never come into place, that there will be a free trade agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom in advance of the full leaving of the UK from the European Union at the end of this year. Just again, I mentioned earlier about agriculture. The two big issues in an Irish context to do with Brexit are political in terms of Northern Ireland and the danger that terrorism may return. But there's also the I suppose the interconnectedness of our economy with that of Britain. Even as things stand, there are parts of Ireland that are more economically dependent on the UK than there are some parts of the UK, if you know what I mean. There are sectors in our economy. Food is the obvious one. We, as I said earlier, produce varying levels of excess of food, but it can be up to 90% in some food categories of what we produce is exported. And our biggest market by far for that is the United Kingdom. Next biggest is other member states of the European Union. And my own background, I have two older brothers who are both farmers, and they're facing decimation, really, if there isn't a trade agreement between the UK and the EU before they fully leave the European Union. So I think that's about. I'm more than willing, and I'll stay for as long as I possibly can to answer any questions, Angela, that people have about it. I hope that has given people a bit of an oversight as to where things stand presently with regard to Brexit and the relationship in the future between the United Kingdom and the European Union.
Terrific. Thank you. You've given us a great deal to think about. Dewey, go ahead with your question. You've got your hand up.
Okay. A couple, within the last 2 years, Caterpillar, a big company here in Peoria, moved their tax records to Ireland and didn't really explain why they did all that. What's the advantage of doing that?
That's a good question, Dewey. I'm familiar with Caterpillar because a lot of my extended field and connections are, and some of them ended up in, I think, is it South or North Carolina, working for Caterpillar as well. But at the moment, while there is a common market in goods and services and common movement of people in the European Union, there is not a common taxation policy. That is still a reserved function for each individual member state. Ironically, Britain would have been one of the main drivers in ensuring that remained the case. That's why, actually, from an Irish perspective, Britain leading is another reason why it's not a good thing, because we want to retain an independent tax policy. The reason we do is because we have a lot of disadvantages. We're a tiny island in the Atlantic that's on the periphery geographically of Europe, and therefore our one of the few levers that we have in terms of attracting investment from overseas is taxation policy. And Caterpillar wouldn't be alone. There are many US businesses, substantial ones, particularly in the pharmaceutical and IT areas, that have, nearly all of them have the European headquarters in the Republic of Ireland. But some of them, like Caterpillar, would have are running certain sections, if you like, of their business out of the Republic of Ireland. They're doing that, Dewey, mainly because our corporation tax rate is 12.5%. It has been since 1995. It's political gospel in the Republic, in that there is no political party, left or right. We have loads of political parties, unlike on the national level, at least in the States. We have 12 or 15 different political parties, and some of them are very hard left, but none of them support increasing the corporate tax rate. The reason being that we have a huge proportion of our people who are at work are working for overseas corporations and conglomerates that have headquarters and have business in the Republic of Ireland. So Caterpillar moving part of their business to Ireland, I would suspect, without knowing in detail, that it's because our corporate rate is one of the lowest. Now, there are countries like Latvia, I think, has a 0% corporate tax rate. So we're not the lowest by a long distance. But compared to the big countries in the European Union, like the Germanys and Frances of this world, they have rates that are 2 or 3 times higher than our rate here in the Republic. And the reason why we tend to get so many investments from the States in particular, one is historical links. The Irish community in the States is strong. 2 is the language, English. I mean, one of the critical advantages for us as a nation post Britain leaving the European Union will be that we will be the only English-speaking country in Europe, which is a huge advantage, and we need to leverage it as much as possible. But also, then it's the kind of it's the education system that we have. It's the public services and the kind of general quality of life. Our way of living in Ireland would be similar in many respects to the United States, except particularly in healthcare and things like that, we'd have better kind of public services, but are free, at least at the point of usage, public services. So those are the main reasons why American companies would be shifting parts of their operations to the Republic of Ireland in the last 20 years in particular.
That ties in with one of the questions in the chat. Joni asks about the extreme downturn in travel and how that's affected Ireland. And even since 2008 in the recession, Ireland took a pretty big hit after the recession in 2008. But a lot of their recovery has been based on that direct foreign investment. So,
yes.
So it's quite understandable why you wouldn't want to mess with a good thing. And there's a great deal that attracts companies and tourists to Ireland. Now, since COVID, what kind of an impact has COVID had on tourism?
Huge. Again, actually, to prove the further complication with Brexit, the UK is the biggest source of our visitors as well. I think 20-something% of the people who come to Ireland every year come from the UK. Now, a portion of that would be people crossing the border between North and South. But most of it is people coming from mainland Britain, if you like, across the Irish Sea. In terms of tourism, our tourism sector was completely closed from a few days before St. Patrick's. We put the country into lockdown, and it remained there from that point, which is mid-March, until the end of June. We were completely in lockdown. All the pubs, restaurants, hotels, with very, very few exceptions, just in the case of essential people who were deemed to be essential workers, all of that was closed. Then in about, as I said, about the end of June, limited reopening took place, and tax incentives and other measures were introduced to encourage Irish people to holiday at home. Because one of the things that tends to happen in Ireland, we get a huge number of overseas visitors, huge number of American visitors. In fact, I think in terms of by country, I think you guys are the second after Britain in terms of the number of visitors. That figure has disappeared this year completely. But what has also happened, two things have happened. Number one, unusually, we had great weather. And Irish people tend to go to Spain, to Italy, to the south of France, Portugal, to Greece for sun. And this year, because of limits in terms of flights, but also the fact that we had the weather here, I was talking to a few. My area, Kilkenny, where I'm from and where I represent, is a big tourist town. And even though they were closed virtually completely till the end of June, the subsequent weeks that they've been as busy as they would ever normally be. Now, they haven't made up the difference, if you like, between, for the period that they were closed, but things have been very busy because Irish people are holidaying at home. Staycation, it's a big thing, a big plank of the current government's policy that's working in terms of what is a crucial industry. You mentioned, actually, Angela, the FDI, tourism and agriculture were the three things that kept our economy alive post the economic crash. We had an economy that was very dependent on the construction sector and taxes received from construction prior to the subprime mortgages issue and the subsequent banking issue that emerged, particularly in the European Union and the Euro area. And as it happens, as I said, my area is very rural. And it's very tourism and food orientated, and those sectors plus FDI were what kept the show on the road 10 years ago, and Ireland made a remarkable recovery because of it. And hopefully, because COVID is COVID, everywhere is affected, but hopefully we'll be in a position to recover from that too.
Well, and in the future, when things clear up, I think there's a great desire among this organization, among our members, to come and visit you. And I'll share that if you have not visited Ireland yet, you should know that Ireland is, I believe, the only country in the world that has a unique relationship in terms of immigration and customs. So when you go get on a plane in Ireland, you pass through customs to board that plane to the United States. When you land in Chicago, you simply leave. You don't have to go through customs again. So, and that's a unique relationship, I'm certain, because of such a huge immigrant population. But one of the agricultural questions I have, kind of related to loosely with immigration, is the fishing industry. I understand that's also been a sticking point for the UK exit that affects Ireland in particular, because they want to be able to fish wherever they want to fish, and sell their fish within the EU without restriction, but that would hurt places like Ireland that also supplies those things. How is that going to work out, or is it going to work out?
In terms of all of the areas that have to be negotiated, this seems to be the one that they've made the least headway on, which is unusual in the sense that it was actually the one that they started negotiating on first. It was a big issue during that Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom. Like Britain and Ireland, along with Spain, have the biggest international waters of any countries in the European Union. Like we own in the Republic, I think it's something like 10 times our size in the Atlantic. And a lot of that is prime enough kind of fishing area. The issue seems to be this, as far as I can understand it. I should also state at the start, a bit like Peoria, Kilkenny is landlocked. And so fishing isn't something that my constituents bring up with me on a regular basis, at least. But it seems to be the case that Britain is trying to negotiate a separate deal on fishing, and the European Union position from the start has been fishing will be part of the overall complete package for leaving the Union in terms of access to the market for all of your goods and services, not just your fish. And again, in terms of access to national waters or European Union countries' waters for fishing. So as far as I can make out from the fisheries negotiations, they don't seem to have got past first base, if you like, that they are still, British position hasn't moved from they want a separate deal on fishing, and the European Union position hasn't moved that fishing will just be part of the whole complete package. And I mean, I think that has to be the case if there's going to, like, if you're going to reach an agreement on everything to do with the economy, then it'll have to be one full agreement rather than trying to, patch together different negotiated settlements for all the aspects. Like, we don't have the time left between now and the end of the year to do a line-by-line treaty on every single aspect of trade and business between the UK and the European Union. But we do have the capability to, what's being spoken about is level playing field, is the phrase that's being used from the European point of view. So in other words, if you're producing a product in Britain and you want access to sell that product in the rest of in the European Union in the future, that product will have similar standards in terms of its production. If it's food, it'll have similar food safety standards. If it's fish, it'll have similar standards as well. So that there is no agreement, and I actually think it'll be one of those negotiations that we will either get the full agreement on everything, or we will not get kind of piecemeal sub agreements on specific sectors like fishing. Fishing is just one of those ones that's very emotive, because Britain is the reason Britain had an empire was because it had the best sailors in the world and the best navy in the world, and there's a huge historical kind of association and almost hang up in a British context about that. And I can understand that. I mean, it is part of their history. But the European Union won't be deviating from the position where we'll negotiate a full agreement or no agreement.
Good. Well, do you think that's part of the UK's saber rattling, that they're pushing, that they're challenging on some issues that they already agreed to in order to get a better position on other issues that they have not yet, like the issue?
I hope so, is the answer. I would have thought it would make sense that would be part of the saber rattling. It's just that the smaller the time window gets, and like it's 3 months now, the more you start to realise, like Brexit, in an Irish context, it has largely been a kind of an abstract issue for the last 3 or 4 years, but it's about to become very live and real. Like so many of our small manufacturing businesses, their biggest markets are in Britain. The part of Ireland I come from, which is the southeast, if you like, It's geographically the closest piece to Britain. We have a couple of large ports neighbouring where I'm from, in Waterford and Wexford. And most of the food that we export to Britain goes through those ports and is produced in the surrounding. You can imagine, in terms of, those of you who have visited Ireland will know this, parts of the West Coast, and I have to whisper this because my wife's on the West Coast, but not very beautiful, but not very productive in terms of food. The food producing parts of the island of Ireland are in the south and the east, and those areas would have a huge negative. There'll be a huge negative impact if we don't get some sort of an agreement on trade. Okay,
well, changing gears just a little bit and thinking about all of the waters, the international waters that Ireland has. Ireland is still not a member of NATO, is that correct?
Yes, not a member.
So do you worry about some of the other saber rattling going on, Russian ships passing through Irish waters, attempts to pull peaceful countries into conflicts that maybe you don't have a dog in that fight, but you might get into it anyway?
Yeah.
What would Ireland do in such a situation if it faced Russia passing repeatedly too closely to Ireland?
It's a question that I probably hold a different view than the vast majority of the Irish population when it comes to things like NATO and international threats. We, in the Second World War, we adopted a position of strict neutrality for two reasons. Number one, we hadn't existed as an independent country for very long, and we were still quite economically poor. And secondly, even though politically we were strictly neutral, in reality we weren't. We were the biggest suppliers of food to the UK then, as we are now, outside of their own borders, if you like. And we were also huge suppliers of people. I mean, Irish people went to the factories to produce the munitions that were being used in that war in Britain. Irish people went to the States. I have my father was a man called Jim Phelan. He had a first cousin, Jim Phelan, who won a Purple Heart in one of the Pacific battles. My father would have known, I can't remember which one, in the American Army. So we had lots of American Navy, I should say. We had lots of Irish connections. Politically, we were neutral, but in reality, we weren't. And we've always kind of traded on the fact that little old Ireland, nobody's really going to attack us. And being neutral in every war since the Second World War, but we have also traded under the umbrella of our neighbours, or the protection of our neighbours. Like the fact that Britain is a member of NATO and Northern Ireland is part of Britain, NATO has a presence in Northern Ireland, which in reality has served us in the Republic as well. We've been getting it on the, I was going to say getting it on the cheap, we've been getting it for free. The reality politically in the Republic of Ireland, though, is that there is no party and there would be no majority, in fact, far from it, for membership of NATO into the future. One of the things that we're trying to get our act together on is things like cyber security and stuff like that, because Russian interference in elections isn't just something that may or may not have occurred in the United States. There's a lot of suspicions about it occurring in Ireland. And we have, in the European Union, we have European Union elections as well. They take place every 5 years for the European Parliament. We have, I think it's 16 members elected from Ireland. And again, there's some evidence that there was outside interference on that. So I'd be happy in the short term if we could get agreement at a European Union level to tackle things like cyber security into the future. But there's not going to be any, I can't see any political change in the Republic of Ireland that would allow us to join NATO or to seek external military support of any sort, to be honest.
Does your membership in the Council of Europe provide enough of a collective, it's not a collective security agreement, but it's a collective
set of norms, kind of, isn't it? It's a collective, yeah. It's not. Like you're asking a question that only an outsider could ask. in an Irish context, we don't see ourselves as targets, you know, and it's just, I suppose it's a reflection of of our own history. Like we were the outsiders on the inside in in the British Empire for years.
Yeah.
Like the things in Ireland, which have changed in recent times, changed a lot actually. You know, a deference to the Catholic Church in the Republic of Ireland was huge and had some really negative impacts that have emerged in the last 20-odd years again. And like we've swung the opposite way now, where Catholic Church is very weak in Ireland. But that happened because, in effect, when the British were in charge in Ireland, the Catholic Church were the closest thing that we had to a government. They provided the education system, the health system. They provided that national identity that we didn't have. It also happened that I suppose we didn't have to take a political position on things like international relations. We were always kind of opponents of state intervention because in an Irish context, the state was Britain. It wasn't Ireland. And that's a historic kind of thing that still, I think, I haven't said it so much out loud, but I think that has a significant impact on our attitudes to things like NATO. The other thing that we have been successful at, like we're on the Security Council of the United Nations at the moment. We won that election only a few months ago. Actually, we don't take up the position, I think, until the end of the year. But we've won that several times. So it's a classic Irish thing, I think. Irish people are good negotiators, are great at making friends and connections. And we've always used our influence, like until a controversy recently, the European Union's Commissioner on Trade was Irish. And he was the man doing negotiation with Britain and with the United States and with Mercosur and the South American countries. Irish people tend to occupy significant positions within the European Union. The head of the civil service of the European Union for many years now has been an Irish woman. It was an Irish woman again until that most recent political storm who was about to be elected president of the European Parliament. 750 MEPs, they're called. And we only have 16, and there was an Irish woman about to be the boss of it. So Irish people tend to leverage their influence very strongly, but there is no appetite, and I can never see it changing in the short term, for involvement in military alliances. I just can't see it happening. And we have huge international waters. We have 8 warships. We can't defend what we have. But thankfully, because again, the borders don't exist in the sea, other European, there is cooperation between European member states in terms of sharing information, so that if there's smuggling of people or illegal substances, that information is shared. There's a common thing called Europol, which is like Interpol, except it's a European version of police information that's shared by member states. So we're not completely open, but we're not in a position to defend ourselves or defend our waters at all by any stretch.
Do you ever anticipate a time when the island would be all one country? Or do you think that Northern Ireland will remain separate? Would there ever be a circumstance?
It's the big question. Like one of the funny things, my father married very late in life. If he was alive now, he'd be 95 or 6. But he travelled all over the world. He was in America multiple times, visiting family and friends. He even in 1974 went to Australia and spent 2 or 3 days in Baghdad. And what a beautiful city it was. Can you believe? That's 45 years ago. He never set foot in Northern Ireland. And until the border infrastructure disappeared, an awful lot of people in the Republic and it wasn't even a case of being afraid of something might happen. Just why would you bother? Why would you queue up for hours when you can get on a Ryanair flight and you could be in Paris in less time? And my father was representative of that. Until recently, I would say I didn't see a United Ireland happening. I see it happening now for one principal reason, actually. I think that the next question that will emerge in the United Kingdom post-Brexit happening is the future shape of that union. And that was a was going to say it was a voluntary union. It wasn't really, but in 1801, Ireland joined a union that already existed between England, Wales, and Scotland. England and Wales joined Scotland in 1701, 1702 in the original Act of Union. Scotland, not that long ago, that Scotland had a referendum where I think by 55 to 45 the result was to remain in the UK. All evidence, particularly since the Brexit issue has emerged, shows if that referendum was held again, Scotland would leave the United Kingdom. And I think that there is slowly in the north of Ireland, even amongst the unionist community, a realisation that there is a chunk of the political class in England that don't care about them. That Northern Ireland isn't economically, it doesn't stand on its own 2 feet economically. There's a huge level of state support from the centre, from London. Actually, the biggest political issue for lads like me in the future, if it arises, will be how will we find the money to keep the Northern Ireland economy alive. But I think, if Scotland leaves the UK, the next one will possibly be Northern Ireland, and it will be interesting to see will it break down along the sectarian religious divide that I've known all my life, or will there be a realisation politically that actually, in terms of economic sustainability for that part of our island in the future, that it's probably going to be best served as in some sort of federal structure with the rest of the island. I don't think we're going to. I think that it'll be a new structure if it happens. But it's only in the last year or two that I really believe that will happen. I hope it'll happen in my lifetime. I got a heart attack 10 weeks ago at the age of 41, which I'm still recovering from. But so I hope I live to see it. But I think it will happen.
Yeah, and happy birthday, by the way. That's a good birthday gift to survive a heart attack.
Yeah.
So, but in terms of, I think your discussion now about the potential of Northern Ireland leaving the UK and uniting with the rest of the Republic is an interesting one that would not have come up except for this EU issue and the UK leaving the EU. Mm. What worries you the most about the UK's exit from the EU? I mean, does it worry you if Northern Ireland wanted to join the Republic? I mean, it'll be a huge expense. They're not quite.
Yeah, but we haven't had, you see, it kind of goes back to, there is a romantic Republican in like, I belong to a political party, the same political party as a man called General Michael Collins, who negotiated the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921, which was what ultimately led to the division of Ireland. He saw it then as a stepping stone. I don't think he expected the step to be over 100 years, but he was a realist in that he knew there was 1 million people living in the northern part of Ireland who were Protestant unionist people, and that we wouldn't be able to blow them all up. Like it's a harsh thing to say, but that was the position that he adopted then, and my political forebears adopted then, and a position that I have held. I think the first thing to watch is what happens with Scotland and movement towards a second Scottish independence referendum. In terms of then, like, if Scotland were to vote to leave the Union, then the Union itself is broken. The original Act of Union, as I said, I think it was 1701, it might have been 1702, was when there was a Scottish Parliament that was separate, which there is now for the last 20 years too, but was separate from Westminster. And it was King James VI, I think, of Scotland, who ended up becoming James I of the new United Kingdom of Scotland, Wales and England. That was the political situation. We had a very significant rebellion in Ireland in 1798, very close to where I live, in Wexford. That's where the Kennedys come from, actually, right beside where I live. But following that political rebellion, then the Act of Union with Ireland took place in 1801, which is when the name of the kingdom, if you like, became the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And then subsequently, after 1921, it became the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which is what the name is now. Will Scotland leave is the big first question. And the second question then is, what Northern Ireland will not leave unless there is some sort of political realization and reconciliation between politicians on both sides of the border in Ireland, that their political interests lie together rather than at each other's throats. There has been no political discussion in the Republic of Ireland about where we'll find the 9 or 10 billion euros per annum to support the Northern Ireland economy if there was to be some sort of unity. I don't see it happening anytime in the too short term, if you know what I mean. But I do see it as something that's on the political agenda now, which I wouldn't have seen on the agenda 10 years ago.
Sure. Well, yeah, that's a big chunk of change.
Yeah. Well, it is when our annual budget is, what is it? It's 70, 80 billion euros. So you're finding an extra 9 or 10. It's a big chunk, a big lot of money then. Yeah.
Yes. So will you run for office again?
I will. Like my family were not political in the sense that my family were community involved. Actually, my family in America were much more political than the ones in back here. But I was fascinated when I was a child. There was a man who was the Prime Minister, the Taoiseach of Ireland at the time, called Dr. Garret Fitzgerald, who led a thing called a constitutional campaign for on social issues to try and open up Ireland. One of the benefits we've got from membership of the European Union and things like that. But he also, in 1985, signed a thing called the Anglo-Irish Agreement with Margaret Thatcher, who was the British Prime Minister, which for the first time gave the government of the Republic of Ireland a say in the day-to-day issues that arose in Northern Ireland. And it was the foundation stone that led to the peace process and the ceasefire and the subsequent Good Friday Agreement. And he got my interest in politics when I remember I was babysitting my little sister. I was 7. I can remember clearly. I can remember what I was eating, what we were doing. And I just wanted to be a politician because I saw this man having an impact on people's, lives immediately in terms of, the violence that was didn't happen for a while at least as a result of his efforts in Northern Ireland. So I intend on I do think that political careers will not be like they were in the past, where people were politicians forever. But I fully intend on contesting at least one more election.
Okay, we've lost your video. Oh, no, you're back.
I'm back.
I think one last question, because this is a good one from Wes. Might the threat of Scotland leaving motivate the general public of the UK to reconsider Brexit, especially with the revelation of Russian disinformation leading to the Brexit referendum?
I don't think it will. And I'd like to say that it would, but I there's a touch. I don't want to in any way get involved in American politics, but there is a streak running through politics throughout the world, of which Brexit is the form it has taken in the United Kingdom, that it's common all over the place at the moment. It's a form of nationalism, I suppose, but reality politically in terms of the United Kingdom is that there's 62 or 3 million people, I think, there, but the England part is 50 odd million of the 60 something million. And actually, if you look at, as I said at the start, the vote of the public in 2016 for leaving was strongest in England. And they knew at the time, that was quite close to when the first Scottish referendum had taken place. So, these were issues that were discussed during that referendum, that this might weaken the UK union. And it happened regardless. And actually, I think since the vote, There were some political commentators saying that, because it was relatively narrow, people should vote again. Actually, I think the support for Brexit within England is stronger now than it was 4 years ago when the initial vote took place. So I don't think, maybe this will swing back again. Maybe if Scotland doesn't leave and 10 years down the line, the politics of Europe and of the world generally will have calmed down a bit. But as things stand, I couldn't see any change if there was to be a rerun of the referendum on Brexit in Britain.
Thank you. Yeah, that's definitely something to think about, though. So again, on behalf of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, thank you so much for all of your time, Mr. Phelan. This has been Phelan. This has been very engaging and informative. And you're right, everybody around here is Phelan. So, Mr.
Phelan.
Yeah.
I wanted to tell you that I worked at the newspaper most of my career, and so I knew Ed and Mike very well. They were in the shop. I was up in the editorial, but I remember fondly Ed being Santa Claus at our Christmas party for 100 years.
Yeah.
And he was a real character. So I will pass along to Mike your good wishes.
Can I just say one thing on that? And this is the last thing I'll say. I'm really honored to have been asked, because Peoria has been a place in my mind all of my life because of my dad's aunts and uncles who emigrated there. But I'll tell you this story before I finish. I was finishing high school in about 96, 97, and we grew up with my uncle Danny, lived with us. And Danny was, he was deaf, but he worked on the farm with my father, and he was a lovely little man. But he arrived into our kitchen one evening, and he kind of shouted at my father. They had a tempestuous relationship anyway, but he said, the long fella is abroad in a car. Now, that's kind of an Irishism for saying that their cousin, who was called Long Neddy Phelan, was outside in a car. My father went out. It wasn't Long Neddy. It was Ed Phelan from Peoria. But his physical characteristics were such that even though my father had never met this man, that he was instantly identifiable. And it's amazing, like the thousands of miles and many years, but the connections particularly between Peoria, because when I was there with Mike a few years ago, I met McGraths and Doolans and people whose family came from my part of Kilkenny and emigrated to Peoria generations ago, but they're still there, and there's still so many connections. So if there's ever an issue that you want to talk to me about again, I'll make myself available, and I might see some of you when I get back to Peoria, hopefully in the not too distant future. Thank you all.
I would like to say to your Sláinte, to your good health.
Yes.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us today.